slideshow?
I will do that.
Go for it. I'm gonna get out of the way and let you.
Okay.
Take over.
Okay. So let's see what this looks like. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Good evening. I'm Tina Wagner, and I'm presenting my thesis work on influences on soil organic carbon in Southwest Washington Pasturelands. My interest in soil organic carbon stems from a growing concern about climate change and what can be done to mitigate its effects. As an avid reader and gardener, I learned about soil organic carbon from several books, all of which emphasize the positive side effects of increasing soil organic matter, which in my study is about 50% soil organic carbon. Further study reinforced the positive benefits of increasing soil organic carbon, increased water infiltration, which is handy when precipitation patterns change and you're faced with sudden downbursts, increased water storage when you haven't had any precipitation for a while, improved nutrient holding capacity, improved water quality, and the list goes on. All of which can be accomplished without developing new techniques or new expensive technology. Additionally, soil organic carbon is the largest terrestrial pool of carbon, holding 3 times more than the Earth's atmosphere. Small changes in soil organic carbon can have large impacts. Finally, I couldn't find any studies that have been done in an environment like ours, with extended growing seasons and ample precipitation, and I thought it would make a good baseline for future studies. My project focused on the effects of habitat types and management practices on soil organic carbon in Southwest Washington Pasturelands. Because this was not a controlled study over many years, I combined field work with a survey to gather contextual data. The survey went out to participants on January 3rd of this year, and everyone sent their responses back by February 10th. My next job was interpreting the answers, or as the social scientists like to call it, scrubbing the data. I grouped the information into categories that I could analyze, such as land management practices, irrigation, fertilization, and pasture renovation. At the same time, I determined which responses did not have enough replicates to make valid analyses or were too inconsistent to categorize, such as dominant forage species. I used resources such as Google Earth Pro and NRCS's Web Soil Survey to map out 5 points at each site. At each point, 8 soil cores were pulled for a total of 40 for the site. They were mixed and then sent off to the lab for analysis. I also collected bulk density cores at 3 randomly selected co-located points, and I dried and weighed the bulk density samples in the lab here at Evergreen. With the data in hand, I conducted statistical analysis with RStudio software. I chose an alpha of 0.10 and log transformed any of the data that proved to be not normally distributed, notably soil organic carbon, soil clay percentage, animal unit equivalents, and start of current practices. The map on the right outlines the range of sites covered in the study and includes Pierce, Thurston, Mason, Grays Harbor, and Lewis counties. There were 36 different soil series across the 26 sites in this study. They were grouped into ecological site descriptions, which are NRCS classifications based on plant communities, soil, climate, water, ecological dynamics. It's a habitat type. This graph illustrates the effect of ESD on soil organic carbon levels. The y-axis for all of my slides, the y-axis is the soil organic carbon percentage. The x-axis indicates the 5 ESD, Puget Lowlands forest, moist forest, prairie, riparian forest, and wet forest. The most significant and influential finding in this project was the high level of soil organic carbon on the Puget Lowland prairie sites. Our next slide reinforces the unusual findings related to the Puget Lowland prairie soil organic carbon levels. These 2 graphs indicate the relationship between soil organic carbon and an aggregate percentage of clay on the top graph and an aggregate percentage of silt on the bottom graph. One of the characteristics of the Puget Lowland prairie soils is a high level of sand and low levels of clay and silt, in contrast to the forested ESDs. Typically, soil organic carbon is associated with higher levels of clay and silt because the structure of the clay and silt particles accrues more carbon than the structure of the sand particles. The previous slide showed that the Puget Lowland prairie sites were much higher in soil organic carbon than the other ESDs. That makes me think that there's something different happening on those prairie sites. Now we'll pivot to the management effects. When I asked the land managers to describe the history of their pasture land prior to 2003, there were many responses. On the graph showing the prior history effect on soil organic carbon from left to right on the x-axis are hayfields, native prairie, and pasture. History as a native prairie shows significantly more soil organic carbon. The asterisk in the title refers to the histories not shown, such as history as a forest or history as row cropping or combinations of those, because there weren't sufficient replicates in the study. In the next graph, the relationship between soil organic carbon and the start of the current practices is a positive correlation. This indicates that soil organic carbon in a pasture builds over time, even if it's not a quick accumulation. The final graph on this slide shows the effect of current use on soil organic carbon. Current uses as a hay field and as grazing land have nearly the same median value with more variation in the grazing sites. However, the soil organic carbon level on the unmanaged, which includes hay fields and your native and restored prairies or sites that were just not utilized for grazing or hay, is significantly higher for either of those other uses. Comparison of land management practices such as irrigation, fertilization, application of soil amendments, pasture renovation, and tilling did not yield statistically significant results. The most common practice was fertilization, with 12 of the sites applying fertilizer. Unfortunately, permutations of these practices meant that there were not sufficient replicates to analyze them. Of note, the sites that practiced tilling for renovation tended to have much lower soil organic carbon. The graph shows weed management effects on soil organic carbon. 3 methods for weed control were identified in the survey. Mechanical, such as brush cutting, chemical or herbicides, and fire, such as prescribed burning. But again, limited replicates of the different permutations constricted analysis. In this case, the only weed management practices with sufficient replicates were the combination of chemical and mechanical alone, with mechanical has significantly higher soil organic carbon. While the graph doesn't show it, again, the sites that included fire weed management as a tool tended to have much higher soil organic carbon. Grazing style was one of the more difficult concepts to quantify. You'll notice on the x-axis the 5 different grazing styles. Continuous grazing means livestock have unfettered access to the entire pasture. Continuous seasonal grazing means that the livestock are out from usually about April to October. Rotational grazing involves movement from one pasture or a smaller portion of the pasture to another. And rotationally integrated grazing incorporates animal needs, forage growth, forage availability, and climate impacts. Wild grazing means wildlife. Wild ruminants graze nearly everywhere they're not excluded, including hay fields, unmanaged pastures, and native and restored prairies, which I've captured by combining the categories of hay and unmanaged pastures. Although there aren't significant findings for these comparisons of the grazing style, I want to point out they're probably not significant because of the combination with the hay and the unmanaged sites. I want to point out that the rotational systems all seem to have more soil organic carbon than either of the continuous systems. Another slippery category in this study were the comparisons of livestock. Deer and elk were not measured, although there were evidence of them in many of the sites. Reported livestock included several flavors of cattle, horses, sheep, goats, chickens, ducks, and even guinea fowl. To analyze them together, a classification of animal unit equivalent, where 1 cow with a calf equals 1.0, and 1 broiler chicken equals 0.008, allowed me to assign a numerical value for each site. In the graph on the left that compares the effect of different animal species on soil organic carbon, the categories from left to right are cattle, deer and elk, and sheep. You can see that cattle exerted a slight negative effect on soil organic carbon. As a note, most of the cattle grazing occurred on the forested ESD sites, which as a group had much lower soil organic carbons than the pasture sites. In the graph on the right, showing the relationship between the relative number of animals on the site and soil organic carbon, there's a negative correlation for AUV, although the finding was not statistically significant. Soil organic carbon in the Puget Lowland prairies is likely inherently higher to begin with because the nature of plant carbon allocation in prairies is typically below ground, and there's a history of anthropogenic burning. Carbon in forested systems is largely allocated above ground into plant biomass, which is lost when your forest is converted to a pasture. Management choices that support continual allocation of below ground carbon, such as limited disturbance of the soil and grazing that stimulates growth without impeding growth, will support soil organic carbon. It takes time to build soil organic carbon, likely thousands of years in the Puget lowland prairie sites. And while some researchers have suggested there are limits to soil organic carbon sequestration due to saturation, the high Puget lowland prairie soil organic levels suggest that claim is not universally true, because the saturation that they suggest is directly tied to how much carbon can be sequestered in the clay and silt portions of the soil. Organic matter that is allowed to accumulate without disturbance can continue to build soil organic carbon. And this is true for the forested ESD sites as well. Although Puget lowland prairies are called prairies, the expectation was that our shallow rocky soils would be really low in soil organic carbon. In comparison, the tall grass prairies of the Midwest, where the A horizons are 60 to 80 centimeters deep, and they have deep-rooted, long-living perennials that over many years contribute a lot of soil organic carbon, our shallow 38 to 46 centimeter soils are largely sand and rock without the deep-rooted grasses. To my great surprise, the Puget lowland prairie soils had the most soil organic carbon by far. The atypical negative correlation between silt and clay percentages and soil organic carbon levels in this study seem to indicate that two possible features are at play. Much of the soil organic carbon on the Puget lowland prairie sites is derived from a history of indigenous burning, and high species richness expanded the pool of soil organic carbon inputs. This study had 9 Puget lowland prairie sites and 4 or 5 of each of the forested ESDs. They are representative of the variation in this region. However, the diversity of soils, livestock, and management practices created many instances of few replicates. There are other factors that may have influenced the outcomes, including the impact of wild ruminants, plant species communities, and even climatic conditions. Rotational grazing that matches the capacity of the land to the needs of the livestock, mimicking wild grazing, and avoiding practices that disturb the soil, such as tilling or overgrazing with too many animals, should support soil organic carbon accumulation. Puget lowland prairie soils already have exceptionally high soil organic carbon levels, despite what may be termed their structural inadequacies. The native prairies have all been degraded over the years, but careful restoration has clearly indicated what is possible. Applying prairie practices to other soils, high diversity of plant communities, extended growth stages of plants, minimal disturbance, and incorporation of fire wherever possible can support increased soil organic carbon levels. Future studies I recommend include controlled grazing studies to measure the impacts of the AUE and species on various ESDs over long periods. Species richness and abundance effects on soil organic carbon with inclusion and exclusion of livestock. An examination of the soil organic carbon sources, charcoal, above ground, below ground in each ESD. Thank you to the many people who helped develop, guide, and inform this project. I started over a year ago asking questions and gathering feedback from anyone who would stand still long enough to answer my questions. I especially want to thank my reader, Sarah Hammond, who is an inspiration to everyone who knows her, and my home team, Tegan, Lily, and Tony, who saved my arthritic knees. Most of all, I'm privileged to have had the opportunity to meet and to spend some time with some very special people who take great care of their lands. Thank you. Want me to stop sharing?
Stop, right? You're like,